My name is Andrew Keogh. I'm going to be your lecturer on the module Digital Games in Contemporary Youth Culture. I just wanted to give a kind of a brief introduction to myself, and you won't be seeing this picture of me on screen for the whole lot, but I just thought it's, to put a name with a face is always useful. And just give you a little bit of background about myself. I've trained as a youth worker and I currently work in Ballymun Regional Youth Resource in Dublin, one of the biggest youth centres in Ireland. I also work as a filmmaker and film producer with my own production company, Bread and Circus. We make feature documentaries and feature films. My kind of educational background is I've a degree in illustration and graphic design and NCAD. So visual communications would be the name across that. And I have a master's in interactive digital media and computer sciences from Trinity. So this particular module and everything around it and involves it is super interesting and fascinating to me. I hope it is to you, and if it isn't, I hope I can help to make it something of an interest to you. So bear with me as I get used to all these tools and try to do that. Okay, now I'm out of here. I'm not going to labour on too much and then just take things up in one-to-one tutorial time. Should there be any outstanding questions, or feel free to email me anytime and I'll address it as soon as we can get back at it. So I'm just kind of getting my bearings with the screencast and my notes here as we go. The structure here will be a couple I've pulled on some relevant sort of reference video material, which explain things a little bit more succinctly than I can on some points. It just gives you a full sort of spectrum view of it, and there's like interesting edits of reference material pulled together already. So I'll use that to illustrate things where needs be. So I'm just going to run through the structure for the next number of lectures. This first one, once I finish the introduction, we'll get into the origins of computer games and just take them from their, starting point right up until the present day. So after that, in the next lecture, we'll talk about I'll assume that no one has any idea of games, and we'll go from there, so I can kind of zip through things pretty quickly and then leave any sort of reference points or take things up thereafter. But the next one, in terms of game types and game terminology, might be kind of key to that. So I'm not going to labour too much on anything resembling terminology today. It'll be literally a kind of broad sweeping overview of objects and places and times in history, of which will be more familiar and the more kind of popular end of it. Game types, terminology, and the mechanics of games, to discuss them so you can understand how to unpack a game in all its sort of different guises and different ways of viewing a game, which is kind of useful in a youth work context to start illustrating some points and facts, or also just to kind of lead groups of young people who are clearly very much interested in this line of things, something we will discuss later on. The third lecture will be about critiquing, so basically an application of the historical analysis of games and then the theory and terminology. After that, we'll talk about the history of simulation games, or I suppose serious games is one aspect of that, but not everything. I thought this merited a lecture all by itself, purely on the basis of it probably being a container for a great deal of gamified phenomena, or a different way of looking at that phenomenological side of computer games in culture. Not necessarily just youth culture, but as far as military sort of role-playing games, whatever, there's be a whole list of things there, and it certainly merits a discussion in and of itself. Then we'll move on to something closer related to youth work and young people in particular, or generations of young people, when we look at the impact of games on youth culture. And this being something, that's just kind of been going from the 50s and 60s. So we've quite a bit to kind of unpack there, looking at how this has become ubiquitous and how it started out as something, a little bit more left field. and who are the adopters or the early adopters of different types of games, and that dynamic that is at play there. We'll discuss that there. The next one will be on gamification. So this is basically covering game dynamics in non-game environments, which is something which is, I suppose, the bigger indicator of the emergence of games and it being ubiquitous. Then the next will be games for social change and global justice, which again is a very, very interesting area, which is, this idea mentioned earlier of serious games would be one thing, docu games, different types of game, not necessarily genres, but social applications of games, which is most interesting and something which is, again, when we look at it from a youth work perspective or a youth advocacy perspective, is certainly very instructive of a number of things. Youth exploitation through digital games would be the next one. And this, I suppose, my reason for putting this after the global justice, social change is kind of the other side of the coin of the kind of phenomenological aspect or application of games to broader culture in a physical sense rather than a theoretical sense, I suppose. So we look at, corporate models that have been set up around this, surveillance cultures, different types of, just monetized versions of it, or, gamification leading a culture in a certain sort of manner that isn't necessarily healthy. Also, we look at behavior, like just basic human or young people's behavior in relation to the volume of errors that are being built up in these sorts of online environments in particular, but also just just to look at a broader sort of set of things there of just with the physical knock on behavior. After that, games and emergent technologies and social movements. On the positive side of the coin again, and this will be more kind of with a future look or with a broader application across a whole lot of the broader tech aspect of it, be it AI, augmented reality environments, virtual realities, how a human positions themselves in amongst all this, and the broader sort of disruptions that are going on across every sort of culture and every sort of realm of life, essentially, from how we work and play through to how we interact with each other, through to any learning and experiences, what merits or justifies a real lived experience in a virtual world. Then that should be the ideal is that would all be a broad enough handle to put across games in a youth work environment, and just to see where this sort of application of these things, or mostly the understanding across all this sort of will feed back into a youth work environment, having a can-do attitude towards young people who do come in with this need or want to understand or interact with games and games environments, and to just apply themselves into these worlds rather than just be consumers of them through the one-to-one lectures or tutorials with yourself, and then the any sort of feedback that comes out, I should have a fair idea of what way this needs to be worked into shape by the time we get there. So let me start here. Let's start with something that we're all a little bit familiar with at the moment. So as unlikely as this seems to belong in a game environment, it could be argued that this is like the first time that we've seen a fully gamified election process going on. Like if this was a game, Trump versus the free world, you could just have the objective of the game or the one mechanic being stay one day ahead of the truth of journalism or the truth of reportage, next to the passing of time and the speed that all this happens at seems to have kind of jarred things and seriously disrupted culture, politics, economics, and pretty much most ends of how we'd engage in public discourse around serious things have been hit by these sorts of phenomenologies, and what we see is that full spectrum of play in this convergence of digital signals that arrive where the lie is the new truth. So someone who can be as blunt and brazen about untruths being the most truthful situation we could look for. Next to the same spectre in the world where, you know, we've people like Edward Snowden or NSA workers who have, you know, revealed truths and been vilified as a result of it, kind of shows an interesting indicator of the other side of that. As we speak, there's a full review in terms of social media and false news stories leading a lot of these sorts of things. Where people get their information from, how valid and accurate that information is, and how it manifests in their behavior or actions or inaction. So it's either that sort of horror show pathology of like accepting lies as truth, or now looking at the whole lot as like we've entered some sort of phenomenon, like fully disrupted play environment, which is somewhat more hopeful, I suppose. There's a broader sort of theory of logotherapy by a guy called Viktor Frankl, who, just to boil it right down, where he talked about in order to have full freedom, with liberty comes responsibility. And this is where I feel games, gamification, game culture, and the broader phenomenological aspects of these things need to marry together with a fuller understanding. There's any number of examples which you'll see throughout the next couple of lectures showing that this is already very much well said and in the offing, and quite hopeful in some regards. So the other side is kind of chiming towards the youth work side of it, where we want to look at the idea of young people as the earliest adopters of all this new technology, the earliest adopters of new types of game environments, and sadly the people who we need to advocate for, because even though they are the first ones to use this new technology, they have no rights as such or input into the direction that all this stuff can go, which makes for quite a confusing situation. That simple question of, like, you know, if young people are the first adopters of it, as youth culture is, it's related to digital rights, it's related to data protection, it's related to a lot of serious things which are disrupting an enormous number of forms of discourse, commerce, and education environments, and just broader culture and social media. Yet those voices are not heard. So as youth workers, it's our job to speak on behalf of young people, advocate for them, but also inform them and educate them of all these issues and the broader culture of all these issues. So that's my kind of 2 cents worth on those vital issues of this convergence of this digital sort of signal, the disruption of that in broader culture, which we're seeing very clearly now, and the natural, one of the core natures of games in general, which is this emergence of new types of play, new types of responses to rules and constructs, and new type of environments. That's pretty much an introduction to the course and to my trajectory of it. Something which, as I said, there's an endless amount of angles and aspects that this, putting together a module like this, can come from. There's by no means a right answer from my end. I've deliberately put in an enormous number of contradictions into what I'm going to say, and ask for just purely to kind of disrupt that being some sort of wholesale thing. So I'm going to move on to a video, something a little bit lighter, just to kind of describe one of the phenomena of this real world disruption of games in a real world environment, and just how kind of full spectrum that can be. This one is somewhat more trivial in one sense, about being related to football and sports in particular, but also very quickly you'll see that it relates to the broader industry and mechanics of it, and has proven to come back with some pretty phenomenal results of that. So I'll just show you this video and then I'll be right back.
One of the things that I'm most proud of, to be honest, is not just that our scouts are now recognised by the football world, but that the football world recognises us.
This is Miles Jacobson, Studio Director of Sports Interactive, who make the world's most compelling and best-selling sports simulation game with over 20 million copies sold.
The game originally started, the two brothers, Oliver and Paul Collier, who lived on a farm in Shropshire. They were playing a lot of what were called play-by-mail games at the time. And they decided to make a game for themselves. And it got terrible review scores from the specialist games press, who just didn't get it at all because there weren't graphics in it. It was all text-based.
FM is so captivating, it has ruined relationships, led to sackings, and been cited in over 35 divorce cases. But it's all worth it if you manage to get your beloved Tranmere Rovers to the Champions League final, having spent hours scouting the new Messi.
We've got 1,300 scouts around the world, and that's broken up into different areas.
We have 6 people internally in the research team. Below that, there's about 100 what we call head researchers, who will be responsible for maybe one league, maybe one nation, maybe a couple of nations. And below them, we have assistant researchers, who usually look at one club or a couple of clubs.
It's not just about how good players are now. That's easy to find. You can find that stuff through Opta, through Prozone. There's loads of tools out there that have that kind of info for a lot of leagues. It's also about how they're going to be in the future. It's about the individual statistics rather than just how much they run each match.
We try really hard not to have those sort of prescribed templates, if you like, because most players don't fit those things.
We spend a lot more time watching players than most clubs do. So if a club's going to sign a player, they might watch them 10 times, whereas we're watching them over years and years and years.
Football Manager's database has risen exponentially from its early inception, going from a handful of leagues with fictitious players to having the most in-depth, real-world collection of football data with around 700,000 current players and staff listed.
As we've modelled more and more leagues, you have to get more and more people, and if you put one league in, that's every player in that league, every staff member in that league. I remember when we added Gibraltar, we thought this is going to be easy, this will be a quick job. Very quickly we had a few thousand people who were involved in football in a place where there's one football pitch and probably about 40,000 people living.
But it's not just about the amount of data, it's about how incredibly accurate it is.
The strike rate for transfers at most clubs is around 50%. Our strike rate's a lot better than that. The last time we looked and tried to work it out was 99.5%, which is pretty insane.
Expectations are so high that everyone fixates on that 0.5%. But for every Freddie Adu, there's plenty more Messis and Hazards out there.
My favourite of all the success stories is Leo Messi.
Alec McLeish's son came to him, having played an early version of Football Manager, where Messi's a 16-year-old rattling around in the reserves, and says, Dad, you've got to sign this guy. He's destroying on my save. McLeish kind of goes, all right, son, leave this to the big boys. And obviously, how different things might have been.
The world of football is starting to turn towards Football Manager and use its extensive data to find that next big thing.
The earliest one that I was aware of was actually Andre Villas-Boas, when he was Jose Mourinho's chief scout at Chelsea. We license our data to football clubs now, so we have a deal with Prozone, or Stats as they're now called.
They were looking to build their database of players. I think at the time they had about 100,000 in their database, whereas we had 325,000 active players. We also have a lot of contact with clubs, so specifically MLS clubs seem to be the ones that are contacting us most of the time recently.
No club will ever turn around and admit that they've bought players directly off the back of the database. But all you have to do is go and have a look at the transfers that have happened in real life based on stuff that's happened in game, and you can tell which clubs have used it, and not just at the top level, at lower levels as well.
With their database growing every year, Football Manager has gone from being a text-based simulation game that complements the world of football to having a seat at the top table of world football.
We will only remain selling games if each version of our game is better than the last, and the last thing that you can accuse us of as a team and as a studio is of being complacent. We make the game for ourselves. We want the game to be as good as possible for ourselves. So we're not going to take the foot off the gas of trying to improve things, because then we wouldn't have as good a game to play.
There's a few interesting points there that I just want to take up on. One is the the deceptive naivety of the game in one sense, which is it being a play environment. And one of the key things with games, I suppose, is we're going to find out that the originators of games, or the makers of them, are players themselves, essentially. So it's one thing where it has to be kind of quite involving and something which is different and unique and interesting enough to merit a play environment for the originators of the games in the first sense. So that's some sort of measure or illustration of the trajectory that games have come along in the broader sense, as we can see that these people are all clearly football fanatics and follow this stuff to a huge degree. The other is the more cultural phenomenon sides of this. One, we can see very clearly that there's one level of disruption going on throughout this game, where being cited in like divorce cases shows just how involving this particular game can be. The other is how immersive it's become from simply a text-based game or something started out via a postal system through text-based into a graphic environment, more immersive graphic environments, then into a real-world environment in terms of the research database that's been pulled together in this game, and something which is, you know, highly speculative in one way, not just in terms of the game and the mechanics of the game, but also in terms of the real world application, where this brings it to a gamified environment where we have, you know, coaches and their staff at the height of their powers in terms of the football industry using this game as a work tool. And the kind of most startling fact I find off the back of that is just the success rate of the transfer market in this game compared to the real world, which kind of shows the AI being quite superior, checking out and validating itself in every transfer window in a football season by the looks of things. The other side is that naivety or seeming naivety of, you know, scouts, a scout system, you know, collecting data on young people. When I say it like that, it sounds a little bit different than, like, you know, what it actually is, which is, you know, a game, but also that being a game which does reference the real world environment of scout systems that do target and look at young people as prospects for future football careers and, you know, the new stars of tomorrow. So there's another side there which is kind of interesting, of just how much data is being accrued in a game environment like that. Something, again, which will chime later on when we discuss, say, online gaming, and online in particular, or in general, about digital rights, you know, just who owns data online and who should be able to access or be able to hold on to that. So I just thought that was an interesting video to kind of show that emergence of the game from a play environment, and also this conversion and disrupting the real world with any number of you know, in any number of ways. If we take as a starting point looking at the prehistory of computer games, and, you know, look at games in general, we can see it has a really rich history, actually going like way back. It goes right back as far as, you know, there's having a religious aspect very early on with, you know, some tribes using dice in certain sort of divinations of spirits, and in the such, like, true religion as well. We'd have avatars and different deities being represented in adoration of these deities. So you know, humans have a very direct link to these types of you know, behaviors, and that would be, we would now consider, you know, a game behavior or a play environment. The dice divination would kind of, you know, evoke ideas of, you know, that would lead towards games of chance and different games of skill. So there's been a lot of research done into these areas by Edward Tyler, would be one who is the founder of kind of anthropology, who would have discussed these things at length. And then if we come further up to more recent histories, and like this picture we have of this, you know, lovely house of everyone sitting around playing parlor games, you know, it'd be games of strategy or turn-based games or card games, and, you know, specific play environments for these types of games being something that humans have had. So we can see that there's a direct line that computer games have come out of, and a lot of the behaviors and also the interactivities of those games has held today as well. If we look to the origins of computer games, this is where it gets kind of interesting very, very quickly, because we'll find that computer games have emerged from not from that sort of naive play environment, but have actually come out of like new adaptations or uses of computer technology or new technologies that mostly had a military bent or use in the first place in the early 50s. What we're looking at here is like an oscilloscope, which was the very first computer game, was repurposing of an oscilloscope to play essentially an early game of tennis or Pong, as you can see from that really simple graphic. I'm just going to play the next video, which is from a series called Rise of the Video Game.
What games do, like any form of entertainment, is they actually are a way for us to kind of have a perspective on our existence, on human existence, just like books do, just like movies do, just like in its own way music does.
In our world, staying connected is essential. Yet even beyond video games, pushing a button today is simply part of living in the 21st century. A mere 50 years ago, that simple act had a very different connotation.
When people think about the idea of pushing the button, in the 50s that didn't mean pushing the button to play a video game, it meant pushing the button to end the world.
As the tension ratcheted up across the globe, computer systems were developed to simulate war games.
No one can foresee precisely what course it will take, or what costs or casualties will be incurred.
The Cold War was a matter of pitting one simulation against another. The games are a technology about simulation. We use them to model real-world processes, to predict results. And to some degree, that's exactly what was taking place in Washington and Moscow. It's like one global version of the game Battleship.
The Cold War was nothing but a simulation to begin with. There is no war to study. There's only these possible future wars, these fears of war, these probable outcomes.
Unlike today's video games, there was nothing anyone could do to control the missiles in these terrifying scenarios.
People like predictable worlds with predictable outcomes, or at least controllable outcomes, or at least the perception that if you got the skill, you could control it. That's very satisfying, because the world in general is pretty uncontrollable and a little bit daunting sometimes.
In 1958, a young nuclear physicist forever changed how the world viewed computers. Willie Higginbotham, who had worked on the first atomic bomb, turned two rudimentary lines and a bouncing ball into the first interactive entertainment experience on a computer. Tennis for two.
Every weekend they would have these contests to see who could come up with the coolest thing. Yeah, Willie Higginbotham came up with this idea that you could take an oscilloscope and make a tennis game out of it.
It was an expression of a kind of rebellious adolescent energy, working alongside the military projects, taking this most expensive piece of equipment at the time and repurposing it to play games.
Suddenly, computers had a use beyond military computations and would eventually reach a galaxy far, far away.
Shortly after Laika's flight, the Russian man in space program began. The same centrifuge that tested Laika was now adapted.
Definitely Gagarin's flight was a very big deal in 61.
Major Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin was launched into orbit around the Earth.
The Soviets had forged the way into outer space, but the U.S. was not far behind.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
The world now had a new obsession beyond war, a race for space, and video games were on the heels of this new passion. In the early 60s, programmers who had an interest in this territory were also making use of the first computers. It deeply influenced Steve Russell, an MIT programmer who first launched video games into that realm with his own virtual space war.
space race was very much in the news, and spaceships taking off, spaceships blowing up were something that you could hardly escape. And further, I had just read Doc Smith's Lesman series. These are a bunch of science fiction stories where the heroes went zooming across the galaxy, inventing new technology as they went, being pursued by the forces of pure evil.
Before he could battle the forces of pure evil, Russell had to master the hulking PDP-1 campus computer.
This is a PDP-1, the first computer I met like a modern personal computer. You can turn it on with one switch.
It was considered at the time a microcomputer, meaning it was only the size of a refrigerator.
It cost $120,000, and it did something simple like typing or being a desk calculator. The programs were typically called expensive, so there was expensive typewriter and expensive desk calculator.
It didn't show anything spectacular. It was so unimpressive that they kind of felt like no way, we can do, with this PDP, we can do something way cooler.
Eventually, we figured out that, well, you could have two spaceships and they could fire torpedoes at each other. Yeah, okay. That's kind of boring. Can you make something blow up? Yeah.
If Tennis for Two was a lighthearted distraction from the war, Steve "Slug" Russell's game was a direct expression of the space race and the global fear of space war.
That was straight out of the times. That was, that feeling of the Soviet paranoia, communism's going to kick our.
It was truly remarkable and ahead of its time, and it was profoundly influential on me.
I think it was the world's most popular computer game for a couple of years, mostly because it was the only one.
The coding instructions for the game were passed from programmer to programmer, and soon, any institution with a PDP-1 computer inevitably had a version of Space War also.
It became open source, and we gave copies of the sources to anybody who looked and anyone who wanted them.
These were young guys in their 20s who were part of a group that we think of today as the first generation of hackers.
It wasn't so much rebellion as exploration. There were all these new things to do and see. Sort of joy of a bright, shiny new erector set with lots of different new parts. And you can build things.
One of the things Steve Russell built was the foundation for what would become the most important part of any video game experience, the joystick.
Originally, the controls were just from the console switches. And then some of the Model Railroad Club guys built a control box using surplus telephone parts.
Steve Russell was also the first programmer to put destruction on the screen.
One thing that I sometimes say is, I unleashed the curse of video games upon the world.
With conflict brewing around the world in the 60s, television was there to document the drums of war. But audiences searched for an escape from real life and found a new form of entertainment. The first video games evolved from the world's passions and fears. But the next generation of games would evolve beyond the world's problems.
Zigzagging across the nation.
Television was a constant source of bad news that one man and one idea would change forever.
And all of a sudden, a video game turned into a hot medium. You now could control what was on that set.
All thanks to a man named Ralph Baer. Widely considered to be the Thomas Edison of video gaming, Baer created the first home console system, the Magnavox Odyssey. Before Baer changed the face of television, he had lived the reality of war himself. Born in Germany, his family came to the U.S. in 1938 to escape the Nazi regime. A few years later, he was drafted by the U.S. Army and served in World War II. Baer's wartime experience sparked his interest in television engineering. Afterwards, he went to work for a company called Sanders Associates.
At the time, they made electronics for defense. And Ralph Baer was a young engineer working there whose background was in television technology.
Baer was hired to design military technology, but soon turned his attention to video games and the development of the first home gaming console. He called it the Brown Box.
The whole difference between what others did and what I did is that I had the vision that there are 40 million TV sets out there that can't do anything except tune in a local 2 or 3 channels.
The Magnavox company has come up with an electronic game simulator that will transform the family TV set into a playground.
I mean, you just couldn't believe it. I mean, this was, at home, on your TV, video games. This is like crazy world. This isn't the future.
Build, we call the all-purpose box. Placing it on the audio modem portion. The all-purpose box contains a cassette.
Twiddle it, moves my paddle from left to right.
The box played 7 different games. Allowed us to plug in a bunch of different accessories. And we produced a game that was fascinating, and it survived. And you can still play today and still have fun with nothing but extremely crude symbology on the screen.
You want to score, Bill? Sure. Okay, 1-0.
We'll play a conservative game. Doggone these switches. Here we go. Now I'm going to do a little English on you. Oops. Damn.
Ralph Baer had changed how the world viewed television forever. But like the pioneers before him, all the fun and games were funded by US dollars.
If you have a really serious and very techie job, you're looking for a little bit of fun in your job, and that's how really video games were born. Somebody screwing around with an oscilloscope, figuring out how to do tennis for 2. And with Ralph Baer especially, working in such a serious field, I think sometimes he had to sit back and really enjoy all this technology that he got to work with instead of just using it for, destruction.
Okay, so that last remark seems to be kind of quite a pertinent one of just it being used for destruction. This idea of that, repurposing these really high-end military facilities and technologies for play is quite an interesting, origin of the computer game. Something which kind of speaks of the emergent nature of them quite a lot, that you're looking at engineers looking for, other uses of something rather than impending doom, and also using those same technologies to give other people an experiential idea of that sort of simulated environment in terms of like shooter games or Star Wars games, or those like essentially fear-based simulations that were happening to become multi-purpose. So that's sort of a really interesting thing that we'll see again now in a moment where we talk about online games. But just to kind of take up another thing about Mr. Ralph Baer and the original Magnavox console disappearing to be, a hacking of a TV to all intents and purposes, for first instance, where he looked at it as, these like dormant devices lying in people's front rooms looking at like news events of impending doom, and then finding another repurposing way of doing it by attaching or hacking them to attach this other device, the Magnavox, to it and give them a different lease of life. So what we'll find is that this early console, or the popularizing of this environment, which is on 2 levels, one being tennis, or like an original a game which people understood of like tennis, or a ball moving or whatever like this, where the basic sort of core gameplay of it was very easily understood, but at the same breath to be able to relate that to shoot 'em up Star Wars environments and all these sort of fear-based things, that, and to repurpose that, it kind of says a lot about the first instance of like inventing game technologies and giving them a popular sort of application. So we have that sort of grammar built up straight away from the big futuristic other experience of a game, and for that to be something which is already manifesting in the youth culture in particular, and in the homes of people. Consoles then, if we look at it this way, from the original Magnavox here at the bottom, so essentially we're looking at 8 generations of console devices in the physical sense of things that plug into computers or devices at home, and have kind of scaled with that. So the earliest ones would have been this really sort of core gameplay of something like bouncing pixels back and forth, which quickly turned into other games with a narrative element attached. So we're looking at, say, games like Donkey Kong and Super Mario. Games like this that would, have some sort of story arc or a character arc, and these aspects that would give it another level of intrigue or a different sort of grammar to come with it, really, as opposed to just a game, a core game objective, which is something akin to like a sports simulator or some other game. So at the same breath, we have the just in terms of the console, so we're looking at the brown box at the top here, and we see how many of these have kind of spawned since there for different sort of play environments, for games having certain mechanics or needing an object to kind of play them, from music keyboards through to guns, through to Wii kind of scanners, sensor-based technologies, and then any number of buttons and button combinations to as the games and the level of difficulty increased with them. So and then obviously we'll see in here there's other mobile devices and the such that had this other sort of becoming ubiquitous, or out of the home then, and out of and not needing a TV set or to be plugged directly in. All singular player, or multiplayer in terms of two controllers plugged into the one device, as opposed to an online or a virtual thing, which it was another so this is just trying to give this picture of the emergence of this, really, and the need for it as the games became more sophisticated. So if we look at the games and we look at it, takes to the third generation before we hit the fourth generation, we hit like 16-bit computers, which means the graphic quality of these games could increase somewhat. So we go from talking about story-based games and things with a story arc through to something with like a 16-bit graphic, which is a much more immersive environment in one way, much more aesthetically pleasing and just kind of alluring in some sense, at the same time as the earliest sort of handheld devices come out. So there's a certain sort of split there. And then we can kind of go on to like 32-bit, 64-bit CD-based games, which would have CD fidelity audio, so it becoming a sonic environment then, or like more immersive, and all these things building up a much richer game environment, with a three-dimensional aspect being applied to those games as well. So there's already the immersion is kind of coming to the fore again. This is emergent stuff that the technology is kind of driving, because the ability was there to do it, and the players, the challenge and the difficulty and all those parameters of like what would make a game interesting for someone to play, what would make a game different to play, how can you apply your imagination to it, how can we make it more beautiful, more curious, more intriguing, all these sort of questions driving this sort of new art form essentially, and an emerging industry, an industry which had been hit a number of times basically, and the content of the games and the delivery of them not matching with the phenomena that they would have built up from the original earlier game, like home systems, to the arcade systems. And this being the arcade systems being something shown a need for social interaction with these devices as well, rather than singular play environments. So that kind of covers a little bit of the ground there, just as a sweeping stop with it. As I'm sure you can see, just it's kind of come a long way in a short period of time. If we're looking at 8 generations of consoles in pretty much like about 50 years, it's kind of quite an interesting snapshot of that. So another thing which has kind of happened in tandem with this from quite an earlier stage as well, but not really noticeable until, say, PC gaming would be, or online games would be the use of an online game or a different play environment, which would have emerged then at the beginning of the millennium, where we're looking at different uses of a technology like the networked computer for gaming environments, and that combining with the kind of the faster processing speeds of PCs, and again feeding with the phenomena, or kind of like a new extension of the arcade environment where you could have like play areas where, you know, be it cyber cafes where people would have gone to play against something which would merit its own discussion later on. I'm going to just show another video then just about the emergence of this online environment. This is also from the rise of the video game.
As good as AI is, there's nothing more satisfying than playing with or against another human being. So the internet has definitely changed the way we make games.
And in turn, the information highway has transformed a whole new generation of players.
They listen to their iPods, they IM, they update their blog and watch television all at once. And if you take one of those away, they recognize it's taken away and they're annoyed about it.
The seeds of this brave new virtual world were sown much earlier than most people think. In fact, the concept of the internet has been around since the 1950s.
And who knows, the housewife of tomorrow may do her shopping like this.
The internet's origins were far from entertaining.
The internet came from ARPANET, which was a military network created to survive nuclear war.
After the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, the United States created ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, in order to regain the lead in science and technology. ARPA soon developed IPTO, the Information Processing Technology Office, which networked countrywide radar systems for the first time. After years of a collaboration between ARPA, private companies like Honeywell Technologies, and several U.S. colleges, the first node of a primitive computer network was created. It went live at UCLA on October 29, 1969. They called it ARPANET.
Pretty much as soon as people plugged computers into each other, they started playing games between them.
Richard Bartle and his partner Roy Trubshaw, both students at Essex University in the UK, developed a defining game that would take advantage of this new connectivity.
It was quite interesting, you know, you'd be talking to some guy from Japan and some guy from San Diego, and then there'd be somebody who was sitting 2 seats away from you.
In the spring of 1979, the programmers launched a multi-user game that would later be called MUD.
A MUD is short for multi-user dungeon or domain. It's a textual online world where people interact with a virtual fantasy setting using text commands.
Somebody, usually a dungeon master, would actually run this and would tell people as they took different actions what the results of those actions were. So they weren't terribly automated. It was really just driven by human beings using the early internet and early chat rooms to recreate, you know, kind of a multiple player virtual dungeon experience.
2 decades later, the internet was ready to take off. And the virtual worlds made possible by MUDs would take on a life of their own, growing into something visual, addictive, and massive. In the 1990s, sweeping cultural and technological changes served as a springboard for the World Wide Web.
There's an explosion of informational technologies, communication, interconnectedness.
Thank you for calling Amazon.com.
A lot of households had PCs, we had good bandwidth, and the political climate was so that even the state would actually subsidize broadband.
And the digital revolution was instrumental in spawning a bevy of virtual world games.
By the time the web really came into being on a commercial level, there were a lot of people itching to be able to get online, essentially, to play, especially in a graphic 3D environment.
Fans of text-based role-playing games in the early 80s could now enjoy the immersive 3D worlds of what became known as MMOs.
An MMO is short for Massively Multiplayer Online Role-Playing Game. It's a game where you can create your own character and have an adventure in a world and meet other people, and you would collaborate, interact with them, or compete with them in a fantasy world setting.
When it was people playing in the basement, it was just, a dozen people at most, but now all of a sudden they're participating with hundreds of thousands of people, millions potentially, and that changes the nature of the experience they're having.
Played over the internet, MMOs are vast, visually stunning domains where gamers can play, socialize, wreak havoc, and create complex stories. One of the first MMO experiences was Neverwinter Nights, launched in 1991.
The first version of Neverwinter Nights was on AOL, and this was one of the first massively multiplayer online games.
The game was made with 2D graphics, but compared to the text-based MUDs of the past, it was a monstrous leap forward.
There was a certain percentage of the population that was going to buy into a virtual community that was text-based. But once they started becoming graphical and visual, a greater and greater percentage of people said, oh, I see, I can see you, and then I can click on you, as opposed to I'm just typing your name.
Yet again, we can see the kind of interesting origins of online gaming, and from ARPANET in particular, and it being a military project, and again some sort of other iteration or other use of that environment, which started from a text-based, essentially related to like early email, I suppose, or forum chats, through to text-based RPG games, through to fully immersive environments where the graphic quality had arrived at the same time as the connection speeds of the internet, and for all this to kind of arrive at the same time and allow that instantaneous online environment, which is quite an exciting one, which is kind of pretty much the breaking off point of where we are now in terms of online gaming and virtual worlds kind of coming along. Again, something we'll discuss later in the likes of the more sort of sociological phenomenon side of it, games such as Second Life, where pretty much everyone has an avatar there and a place and goes, and other people live a second virtual life there in a zany or whatever sort of expressive form that they want that to be, but that being an indicator of where, and that's quite old now already, so we're already looking at nearly 10 years of Second Life, so that's about to go into like another sort of shift, which we will address a little bit later on. So we can look at these. I suppose the key thing to kind of hold on here and to kind of bring it right back to like a youth work context, where it looking like games being alienating or antisocial or something singular like that, where we look at the history of them, or something fantastical or fully removed from like any sort of reality, where in essence it's been kind of the opposite of that, where it's emerged out of like quite serious realities and quite powerful technologies, and there's always been that desire for it to be a social pursuit or a public social element to it, rather than some sort of like lock yourself away in a room, although it does clearly have that element of it as well. I'm just going to move forward with just where we're at in terms of the online worlds, or the new technologies emerging now as well on top of that, where we have like virtual reality and augmented reality games, which again are new. I kind of skipped over mobile gaming, but I suppose when I get into that later, it'll be a case of that mobile gaming has allowed this sort of like public pursuit aspect of it. Most notable, in we look at, say, Pokemon Go, a game like this, and how many downloads, it breaking records all over the place in terms of the money made back and the number of downloads in from its initial launch, next to the full spectrum of the phenomenon side of that, of like people playing this game in a social public environment, the game being mapped across these sorts of environments, and that being a fully augmented interactive game with other players, and this being like some sort of unique like game mechanic of meeting other people following a similar game path, which is pretty much trying to locate Pokemon in the same location as you. So there's all these sorts of occurrences and instances, incidental natures of it, which again are emergent qualities of that type of game. something which is clearly very successful and has chimed with a lot of people in relation to Pokemon Go. And it's just going to have, you know, the next iterations of these types of games are going to get much more sophisticated. So it's a mix of that augmented reality and then a virtual reality and then that sort of full physical immersion inside a game environment, which is naturally where it's always been heading, I suppose. So these are, and then obviously avatars and, you know, other personas or other expressions of your personality. Game environments allowing these things as well. So yeah, we're going to kind of branch off there. I suppose one thing being that looks like kind of a doom and gloom scenario there in terms of everyone walking around with like headsets on and you know, not reacting to each other or needing this virtual form of discourse between them. So I've one last video which is just relating to like the emergent areas of like eSports and where this matches with, say, cosplay and the whole idea of it being like a fully creative physical environment and almost a celebration of all these phenomena, which is giving birth to like an enormous lucrative industries and an enormously rich and abundant culture, which is something that, you know, well, I'll just show you the video and you can see this again, just as a branching off point of just seeing all these things kind of coming full circle and the technologies essentially delivering people back into real world environments and that marrying with all these virtual spaces at the same time, which is as super dynamic as like any young person or anyone interested in technology or games in particular would want it to be.
They're losing to a team that is playing so remarkably well. Huge 28-3, 22 minutes in, the quickest in this series. He goes down and across the map. They will go to the World Championships as the #1 seed. Oh my God!
With hundreds of millions of hardcore gamers and thousands of global tournaments each year, computer games are well on their way to becoming the world's biggest sports.
This is the computer game that we are all gathered here to watch.
And at the center of everything is a whole new breed of celebrity, the eSports superstar.
I guess essentially I'm a 21-year-old who's a millionaire through gaming. Yo, I'll take it.
The best players have left their bedrooms to compete in the world's biggest stadiums. Offered up athletic visas and sports scholarships, athletes play for up to 18 hours a day in dedicated gaming houses, always under the watchful eyes of their agents and coaches. For those who work hard and keep their heads together, real fame and wealth await, with cash prizes going into the millions. But as quickly as their stars can rise, they can also come crashing down when the pressure of top-level competition proves too much to handle. With the screaming fans, the huge cash prizes, and above all, the glory, the pressure has never been this great. Welcome to the world of esports.
Okay, that clip was originally longer. I come back to that when we start talking about online gaming and this sort of like other aspects of it. So yeah, that's pretty much like, you know, it's an enormous amount to try squeeze into such a short period, be a game, the emergence of games and technologies, the history. So I just wanted to give you a kind of a scope of things there. Each one of those aspects will come up throughout the other lectures. They'll come up in different sort of guises and different ways. As you can see, there is a certain sort of overlay and an interplay between all these things, both in terms of historically, in terms of the technologies being used, in terms of the cultural sort of acceleration of this sort of stuff and the disruption that it's continually caused in one sense, to it just being, you know, basically changing patterns. You know, like if we look at that last video there in esports and just seeing this sort of spectacle element combined with even the word sport could be argued to be applied to that in some senses, in terms of, like, you know, our understanding of sport being almost athletic pursuits rather than, you know, puzzle-based sort of things, I suppose. So it is that sort of, there's a certain reworking going on there. And then just the pure carnival of it, and just, it being like people making it their own, essentially, And this is a kind of a key part that's going to go on when we talk about like the issues such as like youth exploitation, or, youth in a youth work environment, or like the young people harnessing this and harnessing the bigger messages, and mostly harnessing the set of tools that these technologies present in terms of how to negotiate the planet now, and all the, if it's a case of like whatever sort of social structures or political structures are needed, or learning structures, or where learning comes from, or the basis of these things, that there's, how much kind of play environments, how much kind of simulated environments, what is a real world environment in those senses. All these things kind of continually clash, which most gamers, or like, people who are like interested in the tech side of it, would just say that it just keeps on giving. Whereas it's clearly a massive departure from what we would know as like a traditional culture, where gaming or games technologies are a hobby rather than something fully immersive. So I'll leave it there, including the introduction. Yeah, I didn't really have an idea. This is the first time I've done this to see how long it was going to last. So we did all right, but I will aim for hour-long lectures with the rest of them. Yeah, I'll put this online. You'll access it. We'll have a chat very soon.